My billionaire grandfather left me his entire estate worth $5 billion. My ex-wife, who left me after 7 years of marriage, showed up to the will reading with her new husband, grinning. Of course, we are here to take our share of the estate. But when the judge read the next page, their smile shattered. You know what's funny about life? It's got this twisted sense of humor that makes you wait 32 years for the punchline. 7 years of marriage. That's how long I played the role of devoted husband to Clarissa, my charming ex-wife who had the emotional depth of a puddle and the loyalty of a cat in a dog park. She once called me her starter pack husband during what I thought was a romantic dinner at Olive Garden. Yeah, romantic. Nothing says forever like unlimited breadsticks and a woman telling you that you're basically relationship training wheels. You're sweet, honey, she'd said, twirling her pasta like she was conducting an orchestra of disappointment. But you're like, the first car someone buys. Gets you where you need to go, teaches you the basics, but eventually you trade up for something with leather seats and a sunroof. She laughed like this was the most adorable thing she'd ever said, while I sat there wondering if it was too late to fake my own death and move to Canada. Good enough for practice, disposable once she figured out what she really wanted. And what she really wanted, apparently, was Trevor. Yes, Trevor, a man whose crowning life achievement was winning a backyard chili cook-off in 2008, and he still brought it up at every social gathering like he'd cured cancer. This guy couldn't spell entrepreneur if you spotted him the first 9 letters, but somehow he convinced my wife that he was her ticket to the big leagues. Back then, I was busting my ass working double shifts at the warehouse, coming home with aching feet and grease under my fingernails, scraping together enough cash to keep us afloat, while Clarissa spent her days creating Pinterest boards titled My Dream Wedding 2.0 and Life After My Starter Husband. Real subtle, right? I'd walk in exhausted, and she'd be there on the couch, scrolling through pictures of wedding dresses and tropical honeymoon destinations, planning her future with Captain Chili Pepper like I was already a ghost. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday. She handed them to me with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for handing out grocery store flyers. Don't take it personally, she said, like she was returning a sweater that didn't fit right. We just want different things. Yeah, apparently what she wanted was a guy who peaked in a suburban cooking competition and thought business casual meant wearing his good cargo shorts to Applebee's. But here's where life decided to stop kicking me in the teeth and start handing out cosmic justice with a side of poetic irony. My grandfather, Walter Harrington, the kind of old-school billionaire who could buy small countries just to name them after his favorite hunting dogs, had been watching this whole soap opera unfold from his mansion on the hill. Grandpa Walter wasn't just rich. He was buy your own senator rich, have a wing of the hospital named after you rich, make Jeff Bezos feel like a peasant rich. The man had built his fortune from nothing, turning a single hardware store into a business empire that spanned 3 continents. He collected vintage cars like other people collect coffee mugs, owned more real estate than some European royalty, and had the kind of old money swagger that made Gordon Gekko look like a weekend hobbyist. But more than that, he had a sense of humor drier than a martini in the Sahara and a memory longer than a CVS receipt. He'd always been fond of me, probably because I was the only family member who didn't show up to Christmas dinner with a business proposal and a PowerPoint presentation. While my parents and my brother kissed his ass and dropped hints about investment opportunities and family legacy planning, I just sat there eating his ridiculously expensive ham and listening to his stories about the good old days when men wore hats and handshake deals meant something. You got heart, kid, he told me once, after Clarissa had dragged me to one of his fancy dinner parties where she spent the entire evening networking like she was running for office. Most people look at money and see what they can take. You look at people and see what they need. That's rare. At the time, I thought he was just being nice to his awkward grandson who couldn't make small talk about stock portfolios and yacht clubs. Turns out, the old man had been paying attention to everything. Every slight, every betrayal. Every time Clarissa rolled her eyes when I suggested maybe we should save money instead of blowing it on her latest get-rich-quick scheme involving essential oils or whatever pyramid scheme was trending that month. He watched her treat me like an expired coupon, watched her parade Trevor around like he was some kind of prize bull, watched her post Facebook updates about finally finding my soulmate, while we were still technically married. The call came on a Thursday morning 3 months after the divorce was finalized. My grandfather's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman who talked like she charged by the syllable, informed me that Walter Harrington had passed peacefully in his sleep. My first reaction was genuine sadness. Despite his billions, Grandpa had been a good man who remembered my birthday and never made me feel like a disappointment. My second reaction, about 30 seconds later, was pure curiosity about what happened to all that money. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My parents showed up in their Sunday best. My brother wore a suit that probably cost more than my car, and even distant relatives I hadn't seen since the Clinton administration suddenly remembered we were family. Everyone sat in that lawyer's office like they were waiting for the lottery numbers to be called, trying to look appropriately grief-stricken while mentally calculating their potential windfall. But the real shock came when Clarissa and Trevor strutted through those mahogany doors like they owned the place. My ex-wife had apparently convinced herself that 7 years of marriage entitled her to a piece of the Harrington pie, despite the fact that she'd spent most of those years complaining that Grandpa was creepy and probably senile. Trevor tagged along like her emotional support animal, grinning and nodding and probably already planning which cryptocurrency he'd invest his imaginary inheritance in. Well, I thought, settling back in my chair and watching this circus unfold, this should be interesting. The lawyer cleared her throat, adjusted her glasses, and began reading the will in that formal, legal tone that makes everything sound like a death sentence. Property here, investments there, charitable donations to various causes Grandpa had supported over the years. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for their name to be called like it was the world's most expensive bingo game. And then came the moment that turned my life from a country song into a revenge fantasy. I, Walter Harrington, leave the entirety of my remaining estate, valued at approximately $5 billion, to my grandson, with no conditions, no trustees, and no interference from anyone. The silence in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it at Sunday dinner. Clarissa's face went through about 12 different expressions in 3 seconds, finally settling on a look of complete disbelief mixed with the kind of rage usually reserved for people who discover their favorite TV show got canceled. Trevor's mouth fell open, so wide I was worried he might dislocate his jaw. My parents sat there looking like someone had just told them Santa Claus was real, but he was only bringing presents for me. My brother started making weird, choking sounds like he was trying to swallow his own tongue. And me? I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, thinking about how Grandpa always said that patience was the most underrated virtue in America. Suddenly, I wasn't the starter pack husband anymore. I was the main attraction, the headliner, the deluxe edition with all the premium features. $5 billion doesn't just change your bank account. It changes your entire existence, transforms you from background character to leading man in the story of your own life. The joke, as it turned out, was on everyone who'd written me off as a loser with no ambition and no future. Especially on my dear ex-wife, who was now staring at me like I'd just grown a second head, both of which were wearing crowns. You know what they say about money. It's got this magical ability to turn invisible people into your best friends overnight. I swear, the news of my inheritance must have traveled faster than gossip at a church bake sale, because suddenly everyone and their mother was hitting me up like I was running a personal ATM service. But nobody, and I mean nobody, had the audacity quite like my dear ex-wife Clarissa. 2 days. That's how long it took after the will reading for my phone to buzz with a text from a number I thought I'd successfully blocked 6 different ways. Hey stranger winking face, we should catch up sometime. Miss talking to you, red heart. The emoji usage alone should have been a federal crime. This is the same woman who, just 4 months ago, told me I had the personality of unsalted crackers and that talking to me was like watching paint dry, but less entertaining. I stared at that text for a solid 5 minutes, wondering if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The sheer balls on this woman were truly something to behold. For 3 years after our divorce, I'd gotten nothing but radio silence. No happy birthday texts. No, how are you holding up messages. Not even a courtesy, sorry your goldfish died, when Mr. Bubbles passed away last summer. Complete radio silence, like I'd never existed, like those 7 years of marriage were just some weird fever dream she'd rather forget. But now she missed talking to me. Right. And I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I'd just inherited enough money to buy a small island and name it after myself. What a coincidence that her sudden nostalgia for our deep, meaningful conversations happened to coincide perfectly with my transformation from broke ex-husband to billionaire bachelor. I didn't respond immediately because, honestly, I was having too much fun imagining her sitting there with Trevor, probably pacing around their sad little rental house, crafting the perfect, casual message that would reel me back in. I could picture her trying on different outfits, practicing her innocent smile in the mirror, maybe even watching YouTube tutorials on how to win your ex back, while Trevor sat in the background eating cereal and wondering why his lottery ticket girlfriend suddenly cared about reconnecting with her loser ex-husband. The courthouse meeting was her idea, of course. Just to talk, she'd said when I finally called her back, using that sweet, syrupy voice she usually reserved for talking to puppies and elderly relatives who might leave her money in their wills. I know this whole inheritance thing must be overwhelming for you, and I just want to make sure you're okay. Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what kept her up at night, my emotional well-being. I showed up early because I wanted a front row seat to whatever performance she was planning to put on. The courthouse wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it had that official, intimidating vibe that probably made her think she'd have some kind of legal advantage. Like maybe if she presented her case in a building with marble floors and American flags, it would somehow make her claims more legitimate. She strutted in 20 minutes late, because of course she did, wearing what I can only describe as her serious businesswoman costume. A black blazer that looked like she'd borrowed it from a funeral director, matching pants that were trying way too hard to say, "I'm professional and definitely not here for the money," and shoes that clicked against the floor like a countdown timer to disappointment. She'd even done something fancy with her hair, the kind of complicated updo that probably took 2 hours and half a can of hairspray to achieve. But the real star of the show was Trevor, trailing behind her like a lost puppy at a dog show. This guy had somehow managed to squeeze himself into what I assumed was his only suit, a navy blue number that looked like it had been purchased at a going-out-of-business sale at Men's Warehouse sometime during the Bush administration. The jacket was too tight, the pants were too short, and he kept tugging at his tie like it was personally strangling him. But hey, at least he'd tried, right? They approached me with the kind of coordinated confidence you usually only see in really bad amateur theater productions. Clarissa led the charge with her practice smile, the one she used to use on car salesmen and customer service representatives, while Trevor flanked her like some kind of discount bodyguard. They looked like Bonnie and Clyde, if Bonnie had gotten her criminal strategy from Pinterest, and Clyde couldn't figure out how to work a can opener without calling tech support. "Hi, sweetie," Clarissa cooed, and I swear to God, she actually batted her eyelashes. Like, actually batted them. Like she was auditioning for a 1950s commercial about how to catch a husband. "You look good. Really good. Has anyone ever told you that money agrees with you?" Trevor stepped forward and extended his hand like we were old buddies meeting up for a beer. "Hey, bro," he said, because apparently we were bros now. "Crazy about your grandpa, huh? But hey, what a way to go out. Leaving his favorite grandson set for life." He pumped my hand with the enthusiasm of a used car salesman who'd just spotted a customer with terrible credit and low standards. I wanted to laugh, but I was too fascinated by the sheer audacity of it all. These were the same people who, less than a year ago, had made sure everyone at our mutual friend's barbecue knew that I was a dead-end loser who would never amount to anything. Clarissa had actually told people that leaving me was the best decision she'd ever made, and that she finally understood what happiness felt like now that she was with a real man who understood her ambitions. Of course, Clarissa continued, settling into her chair like she was hosting her own talk show. "We're here to discuss our share of the estate." Our share. Just like that, she'd promoted herself from ex-wife to business partner. I mean, 7 years of marriage has to count for something, right? We built a life together, shared dreams, supported each other through thick and thin. Supported each other through thick and thin. This from the woman who once told me I was emotionally exhausting because I'd gotten sad when my dog died. The same woman who'd spent our anniversary dinner texting other people because she was networking and my company wasn't contributing to her personal brand development. Trevor nodded along like a bobblehead in an earthquake. "Absolutely, bro. And hey, I know this might be awkward, but Clarissa and I, we're like a team now. What affects her affects me, you know? We're thinking about the future, about building something together, and honestly, this inheritance could be the seed money for some really exciting ventures. I bet it could. I was already picturing Trevor's business plan, probably scrawled on a napkin in crayon. Step 1. Get money from Clarissa's ex. Step 2. Invest in cryptocurrency/energy drinks/fidget spinners. Step 3. Profit. This was the same guy who'd once tried to start a business selling artisanal ice cubes and couldn't understand why nobody wanted to pay $5 for frozen water, even if it was locally sourced from his kitchen tap. Look, I said, leaning back in my chair and enjoying the show. I appreciate you both coming down here to... What exactly? Congratulate me? Because if that's what this is, thanks. Really, your support means everything. I could practically see the wheels turning in Clarissa's head as she tried to figure out if I was being genuine or if I was screwing with them. Well, of course we're happy for you, she said, though her smile was starting to look a little strained around the edges. But we're also practical people, and we know that sudden wealth can be challenging, overwhelming. That's why we think it makes sense for us to be involved, to help you manage this responsibly. Responsibly. Coming from a woman who once maxed out 3 credit cards buying essential oils because she thought she could become a wellness entrepreneur, and a man whose idea of financial planning involved checking his horoscope for lucky numbers. Yeah, these were definitely the people I wanted handling my billions. The best part was watching them try to maintain their act, while slowly realizing that I wasn't buying what they were selling. Clarissa's professional facade started cracking like cheap makeup in the heat, and Trevor's confident bro-speak began faltering as it dawned on him that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as easy as they'd thought. I sat there, hands folded, smiling like I was watching the world's most entertaining comedy show. Because in a way I was. And the best part? The show was just getting started. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not flashy cars or gold chains or posting pictures of your breakfast on Instagram with hashtags about living your best life. Real power is my grandpa Walter buying an entire 18-hole golf course because some pompous jackass in plaid shorts told him his swing looked like a drunk flamingo having a seizure. Most people would have just switched courses or maybe taken a few lessons. But Grandpa dropped $2.5 million cash just so he could walk up to that guy the next week and say, "You know what, pal? I've been thinking about what you said, and you're absolutely right. My swing does suck. Good thing it's my course now, so you can play somewhere else." That was Walter Harrington in a nutshell. Petty as hell, powerful enough to back it up, and absolutely my hero in every way that mattered. The man didn't just have money. He had style, he had principles, and he had a sense of humor drier than a martini in Death Valley. While other rich guys collected art or vintage wines, Grandpa collected moments of pure, unadulterated revenge served ice cold with a side of go screw yourself. I remember being maybe 12 years old, sitting in his massive leather chair in his study while he told me that story, surrounded by walls lined with books he'd actually read and awards from charities he'd actually supported. Not like these Instagram philanthropists who take a selfie handing out one sandwich and act like they've solved world hunger. Grandpa did his good deeds quietly, but when someone crossed him, that's when the whole world got to watch the show. "You see, kiddo," he'd told me, lighting up one of his Cuban cigars that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Money isn't about buying stuff. Any idiot with a credit card can buy stuff. Money is about buying freedom. The freedom to tell people exactly what you think of them without worrying about the consequences. He lived by that philosophy every single day. When the mayor tried to shake him down for a bigger donation to his re-election campaign, Grandpa bought the local newspaper and ran a front-page expose about his honor's creative expense account management. When his neighbor complained about the unsightly vintage car collection in his driveway, Grandpa bought the neighbor's house, tore it down, and turned the lot into a parking area for even more classic automobiles. The man didn't just hold grudges. He curated them like fine wine and served them at exactly the right temperature. But the thing about Grandpa that most people never understood was that his legendary pettiness came from a place of genuine principle. He wasn't just some rich guy throwing tantrums because he could afford to. He was a man who'd built his empire from absolutely nothing. Started with one dingy hardware store that barely turned a profit, and he never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. "I've been poor, and I've been rich," he told me during one of our Sunday afternoon talks, when I was going through my particularly rough patch with Clarissa's constant complaints about our financial situation. And let me tell you something, being rich is better. Not because of the stuff you can buy, but because of the stuff you don't have to put up with. When you've got money, people can't treat you like garbage and expect you to smile about it. He'd been watching my marriage implode from his mansion on the hill like it was his personal soap opera, and let me tell you, he had opinions. Strong ones. The first time I brought Clarissa to one of his dinner parties, she spent the entire evening working the room like she was running for political office, name-dropping every semi-important person she'd ever met and pitching her latest get-rich-quick scheme to anyone who'd listen. Essential oils 1 month, some kind of protein powder pyramid thing the next, always convinced that her big break was just one Instagram post away from making her a millionaire. Grandpa watched this performance with the kind of detached amusement you usually see at a zoo when the monkeys are putting on a particularly entertaining show. After she excused herself to powder her nose, probably to take selfies in his guest bathroom, he leaned over to me and said, "Son, that woman looks at you like you're a practice round before the real game starts." At the time, I thought he was just being his usual cranky self. Grandpa had never been particularly impressed by anyone who tried too hard to impress him, and Clarissa was definitely trying. She'd worn her most expensive dress, which, knowing our financial situation, meant she'd probably maxed out another credit card, and spent 45 minutes on her makeup, creating what she called her networking face. She wanted to make an impression, all right, just not necessarily on me. But Grandpa saw right through her act from day one. He watched her treat me like her personal ATM and emotional punching bag. He saw how she'd roll her eyes whenever I tried to contribute to conversations about anything more sophisticated than reality TV or celebrity gossip. He noticed how she'd forget to mention me when she was introducing herself to his wealthy friends, like I was some embarrassing relative she was stuck with instead of her actual husband. The Trevor situation really set him off. When Clarissa started her not-so-subtle campaign to upgrade from starter husband to premium model, Grandpa didn't just disapprove. He took it personally. He'd seen me working my ass off, trying to build something decent with a woman who was already shopping around for my replacement, and it offended every fiber of his old-school sensibilities. A man's word used to mean something. He'd grumbled during our last conversation, about 3 months before he passed. We were sitting on his back porch, looking out over his perfectly manicured lawn that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salary. When you made a promise, you kept it. When you committed to something, you saw it through. These days, people treat marriage like a lease agreement. Soon as something better comes along, they're ready to trade up. He'd been talking about Clarissa, but I could tell he was thinking about bigger things too. About a world that had changed in ways he didn't always appreciate, where loyalty was optional and integrity was negotiable. Grandpa had built his fortune on handshake deals and his word being his bond. The idea that someone could just walk away from a commitment because they found something more convenient or profitable, that went against everything he believed in. "You know what's going to happen, don't you?" he asked me that day, taking a long drag from his cigar and watching the smoke drift away in the evening breeze. "She's going to leave you for that chili cook-off champion. And then she's going to come sniffing around here thinking she's entitled to a piece of what I've built. Mark my words, kiddo, when the money comes out, the vultures start circling." I thought he was being paranoid, maybe a little bitter about getting older and watching the world change around him. But Grandpa Walter hadn't gotten to where he was by being wrong about people. He'd spent 70-plus years studying human nature, and he could spot a gold digger from 3 counties away. "When that happens," he continued, smiling that particular smile that usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day, "you just smile and watch them choke on their own greed. I've got plans for people like that." I should have known he meant it literally. Picture this scene. A mahogany-paneled conference room that screamed old money and older lawyers, complete with oil paintings of dead judges and the kind of leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been opened since the Carter administration. The whole place smelled like furniture polish and shattered dreams, which seemed pretty appropriate for what was about to go down. Judge Whitaker, a guy who looked like he'd been personally carved out of granite by the founding fathers themselves, sat at the head of a conference table that could have doubled as a landing strip, flipping through Grandpa's while like he was reading the morning comics. This wasn't just any old reading, though. This was the legal equivalent of the Super Bowl, the Oscars, and a public execution all rolled into one spectacular event. Every seat around that massive table was filled with someone who thought they were about to hit the lottery, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a butter knife and serve at Sunday dinner. My parents had arrived 30 minutes early, dressed like they were attending a state funeral and a job interview simultaneously. Mom wore her serious occasion black dress, the same one she'd worn to every wedding, funeral, and court appearance for the past 15 years, and kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues even though Grandpa had been gone for less than a week. Dad sat ramrod straight in his best suit, the one he usually reserved for church and IRS audits, checking his watch every 30 seconds like punctuality was going to somehow increase his inheritance. My brother Jake showed up looking like he'd raided Gordon Gekko's closet, sporting a pinstriped suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent and a tie that was trying way too hard to say, "I'm ready for boardroom responsibilities." He'd been practicing his surprised but gracious face in the car mirror, I could tell, because he kept flashing these weird, toothy grins at random intervals like a politician at a county fair. But the real stars of this legal soap opera were the extended family members who'd crawled out of the woodwork like roaches when the lights come on. Cousin Linda from Phoenix, who hadn't spoken to Grandpa since the Clinton administration, but suddenly remembered how close they'd always been. Uncle Bob's widow, Aunt Martha, clutching a folder of what looked like handwritten IOUs from poker games in 1987. Even Great-Aunt Gertrude had made the trip from Florida, rolling in with her oxygen tank and enough jewelry to blind a small aircraft. These people had shown up with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for terminal lottery addicts. They sat there trying to look appropriately grief-stricken while mentally calculating square footage and stock portfolios, whispering among themselves about family obligations and rightful inheritance like they were discussing the weather. And then, like the cherry on top of this whole dysfunction Sunday, in walked Clarissa and Trevor. My ex-wife had gone full grieving family member for the occasion, wearing a black outfit that was probably supposed to look respectful, but somehow managed to seem more like she was auditioning for a reality show about wealthy widows. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, an actual handkerchief, like she was starring in a Tennessee Williams play, and kept making these soft little sobbing sounds that fooled absolutely nobody who'd ever met her. Trevor followed behind her like a discount bodyguard, squeezed into what was obviously his only suit and looking about as comfortable as a cat in a bathtub. The guy kept tugging at his collar and shifting from foot to foot, probably because he'd never been in a room that expensive and was worried he might break something just by breathing on it. But what really killed me was the way he kept nodding solemnly at everyone, like he was some kind of grief counselor instead of the guy who'd helped break up my marriage. They took their seats with the kind of exaggerated dignity you usually see at high school graduation ceremonies, Clarissa positioning herself where she could make meaningful eye contact with the judge, while Trevor sat there looking like he was trying to solve a complicated math problem in his head, probably calculating how much chili he could buy with his imaginary inheritance. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, the kind of official throat clearing that immediately silenced every whispered conversation and nervous fidget in the room. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for, the reading of the will that would determine who got to ride off into the sunset in Walter Harrington's metaphorical golden chariot. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made you want to straighten your tie and confess to crimes you hadn't committed. "We are here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Walter James Harrington, deceased." The room went so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the parking lot. Every eye was focused on that thick stack of papers in the judge's hands. Every brain was running calculations, and every heart was probably beating fast enough to power a small generator. This was the moment of truth, the great reveal, the answer to the question that had been keeping half of these people awake at night for the past week. Judge Whitaker flipped through the first few pages with the casual indifference of a man who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Property distributions, charitable donations, specific bequests to various organizations Grandpa had supported over the years. $1 million here for the Children's Hospital, $500,000 there for the local animal shelter, generous donations to 3 different universities, and a scholarship fund for kids who couldn't afford college. My parents shifted nervously in their seats. Jake loosened his tie slightly. Cousin Linda started breathing a little faster. Everyone was waiting for their name to be called like it was the world's most expensive roll call. And then came the moment that turned my life from a sad country song into a blockbuster revenge fantasy. I, Walter James Harrington, Judge Whittaker, read in that steady, official tone that made every word sound like it was being carved into stone, leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all properties, investments, businesses, and liquid assets, valued at approximately $5 billion, to my grandson. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I swear I could hear individual dust motes settling on the conference table. It was like someone had hit the pause button on reality itself. Every face in that room went through the same progression: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally, varying degrees of rage, despair, or shock. Clarissa's carefully composed grief face cracked like a cheap vase hitting concrete. Her mouth fell open, so wide I was genuinely concerned she might dislocate her jaw, and those fake tears dried up faster than a puddle in the desert. She looked like someone had just told her that gravity was optional, and she was about to float away. Trevor's expression was even better. The poor guy went through about 12 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds, finally settling on a look of pure bewilderment, like someone had just explained quantum physics to him in ancient Greek. His confident bro demeanor evaporated instantly, replaced by the kind of confusion you usually see in people who've just woken up in the wrong century. My mother actually gasped, not a little intake of breath, but a full-on, theatrical gasp that probably registered on seismic equipment 3 states away. She started fanning herself with her purse like she was auditioning for Gone with the Wind, while Dad just sat there looking like someone had told him the IRS wanted to audit his entire existence. Jake made a sound that was part cough, part choke, and part dying wail. His carefully practiced, gracious loser smile melted like ice cream in July, replaced by the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who'd just watched their lottery numbers come up 1 digit off. And me? I just sat there, hands folded in my lap like I was waiting for the bus, thinking about how Grandpa always said that the best revenge was living well. Though in this case, living well was going to involve about $5 billion and watching my ex-wife's dreams crumble in real time. The judge cleared his throat again, probably to make sure everyone was still breathing, and continued reading the will. But honestly, nobody was listening anymore. They were all too busy processing the fact that the family loser had just inherited enough money to buy small countries, while they got to go home empty-handed and explain to their spouses how they'd miscalculated this particular family lottery. The silence that followed Judge Whittaker's announcement lasted exactly long enough for everyone's brains to process what they'd just heard, compute their sudden shift from potential inheritors to witnesses at someone else's lottery win, and then collectively lose their absolute minds. It was like watching a bunch of people simultaneously realize they'd been playing musical chairs and there was only one seat left, except the seat was made of solid gold and came with its own private island. Clarissa was the first to recover, because of course she was. My ex-wife had always been quick on her feet when it came to damage control and creative reinterpretation of reality. Within about 10 seconds, she'd managed to reconstruct her entire facial expression from what the actual hell back to something approaching her practiced, supportive partner look, though it was hanging together about as well as a house of cards in a hurricane. "Oh well, of course he'll need guidance," she stammered, her voice doing that thing where it goes up an octave when she's bullshitting at maximum capacity. I mean, $5 billion is a tremendous responsibility well, for anyone really, but especially for someone who's never had to manage that kind of wealth before. She gestured at me like I was a particularly slow child who'd just been handed the nuclear launch codes and might accidentally destroy the world if left unsupervised. I had to give her credit for the speed of her pivot. Less than 30 seconds ago, she'd been sitting there with her mouth hanging open like a broken mailbox, and now she was positioning herself as my financial advisor and life coach. It was actually impressive in its shamelessness, like watching a master class in how to turn complete defeat into a strategic opportunity. Trevor, meanwhile, was still stuck in the blinking and processing phase, his brain apparently running some kind of slow-motion replay of the judge's words, trying to figure out where exactly his imaginary inheritance had gone wrong. But once Clarissa's elbow found his ribs, and trust me, I knew that elbow well. It had been nudging me toward various bad decisions for 7 years. He snapped back to attention like a soldier who'd just heard reveille. Yeah, absolutely, bro. He chimed in, suddenly finding his voice and his trademark bro-speak confidence. Money can really change a person, you know? Not saying it will, but it can. But hey, don't worry about it, man. We've got your back. Me and Clarissa, we're like a team now, and we'll keep you grounded, keep you real, make sure all this wealth doesn't go to your head. This profound wisdom was coming from a guy who once spent 3 hours at a casino because he was convinced the slot machine was due for a payout, and who had tried to start a business selling premium tap water in mason jars for $8 a bottle. Trevor's idea of financial planning involved checking his horoscope for lucky numbers and buying scratch-off lottery tickets based on which ones had the prettiest designs. That's very thoughtful of you both, I said, leaning back in my chair and trying not to smile too obviously. Really touching, actually. Your concern for my well-being is just overwhelming. I could practically see the gears turning in Clarissa's head as she tried to figure out whether I was being sincere or screwing with them. Spoiler alert, I was definitely screwing with them and enjoying every second of it. Judge Whitaker, who had clearly seen this type of post-reading drama before, cleared his throat loudly enough to cut through the family therapy session that was developing in his office. Perhaps we should continue with the reading before everyone starts planning the deceased grandson's financial future, he said dryly, adjusting his glasses and looking down at the will like it contained even more surprises. And boy, did it ever. Because Grandpa Walter, that magnificent bastard, had apparently anticipated this exact scenario and prepared for it like he was planning the D-Day invasion of greedy relatives and gold-digging ex-wives. The estate is to be managed solely and exclusively by my grandson. The judge continued reading, his voice taking on that particular tone judges use when they're about to drop a legal bombshell that's going to ruin someone's entire day. With no trustees, no oversight committee, no financial advisors appointed by the court, and absolutely no interference from family members, former spouses, or anyone else who might suddenly discover an interest in his welfare. If I thought the silence after the inheritance announcement was impressive, this one was absolutely breathtaking. You could have performed surgery in that room without anesthesia because everyone was so shocked they probably couldn't feel pain anymore. It was like Grandpa had reached out from beyond the grave, looked at every person in that room who was already mentally spending his money, and said, "Not so fast, you vultures." Clarissa's carefully reconstructed supportive expression shattered like a cheap wine glass hitting concrete. Her mouth fell open again, but this time it stayed that way, like her jaw muscles had just given up entirely. The color drained out of her face so fast I was worried she might actually faint, which would have been awkward but also kind of hilarious. Trevor made a sound like air being let out of a balloon, not a sudden pop, but that long, slow hissing noise that happens when something is deflating beyond any hope of repair. His confident bro-speak seemed to have abandoned him entirely, leaving him sitting there opening and closing his mouth like a goldfish who'd suddenly realized he was in a bowl instead of the ocean. My parents looked like they'd been hit by a freight train made entirely of disappointment and unfulfilled expectations. Mom actually clutched her pearls, literally clutched them, like she was in a Victorian novel, while Dad just stared at the judge like he was waiting for him to say, "Just kidding," and reveal that this was all some elaborate practical joke. But the judge wasn't done. Oh no, Grandpa had one more twist in store, because apparently he believed in being thorough when it came to crushing people's dreams and making sure they stayed crushed. Furthermore, Judge Whitaker continued, and I swear I could hear everyone in the room collectively hold their breath again. Any attempt to contest this will, challenge these provisions, or interfere with the beneficiary's management of the estate will result in the immediate forfeiture of any and all bequests, gifts, or considerations that person might have otherwise received from the estate, both now and in the future. Now that was a mic drop worthy of a standing ovation. Grandpa hadn't just locked down his money. He'd built a legal fortress around it, complete with booby traps for anyone stupid enough to try and climb the walls. It was like he'd anticipated every possible angle of attack and prepared countermeasures that would make Sun Tzu weep with envy. I looked around the room at all those disappointed faces and thought about Grandpa's last words to me. When they come sniffing around after I'm gone, just smile and watch them choke on their own greed. So that's exactly what I did. I smiled, not a big, obvious grin that would make me look like a jackass, but just a small, satisfied smile that said I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And they were exactly where they deserved to be, empty-handed and legally prohibited from doing anything about it. The next week turned into what I can only describe as the most pathetic comedy tour ever conceived, starring my ex-wife and her chili champion boyfriend in a production I like to call How to Humiliate Yourself While Begging for Money You Don't Deserve. It was like watching a really bad dinner theater production of A Streetcar Named Desire. Except instead of Blanche DuBois depending on the kindness of strangers, it was Clarissa depending on the stupidity of her ex-husband. The first performance came on a Tuesday morning, because apparently Clarissa had decided that showing up at my apartment at 8:30 a.m. was the perfect time to launch her charm offensive. I was still in my pajamas, eating cereal and watching the morning news like a normal human being, when I heard this weird scratching sound at my door. At first I thought maybe a raccoon had gotten into the hallway again. It had happened before, but then I heard Clarissa's voice calling my name in that sing-song tone she used to use when she wanted something expensive. I opened the door to find her standing there in what appeared to be a fake fur coat that looked like she'd mugged a particularly unfortunate Muppet. The thing was this weird brownish color that nature had never intended for any living creature, and it was shedding like a golden retriever in summer. She was also carrying a casserole dish, because nothing says, "I want your billions," like showing up with what was probably a frozen lasagna from Costco heated up in a fancy container. "Sweetie," she practically sang, pushing past me into my apartment like she still lived there. "I brought you breakfast. Well, technically it's lunch food, but I thought you might want something homemade instead of that processed cereal garbage you're always eating." She set the casserole down on my counter and immediately started rearranging my kitchen like she was staging it for a real estate showing. Behind her, Trevor shuffled in wearing what I assumed was his casual business outfit. Khakis that looked like they'd been pressed with a waffle iron and a polo shirt that was trying way too hard to say, "I'm approachable, but also financially responsible." He headed straight for my refrigerator and leaned against it like he owned the place, which was particularly galling since he'd never contributed so much as a bottle of ketchup to my household expenses during the entire duration of his relationship with my ex-wife. "Hey, bro," he said, nodding at me like we were old college buddies meeting up for a beer. "Nice place you got here. Very authentic. Very real, you know? Not pretentious at all." He said this while looking around my apartment like he was a food critic reviewing a gas station hot dog, technically eating it, but making it clear he'd prefer to be literally anywhere else. The thing about my apartment was that it was perfectly fine. Not fancy, not a dump. Just a normal place where a normal person might live if they weren't obsessed with impressing strangers or maintaining some kind of Instagram-worthy lifestyle. But Trevor was clearly cataloging every piece of furniture from Target, every generic brand product in my cupboards, every sign that I was still living like someone who had to check his bank balance before buying groceries. "You know," Clarissa continued, opening my refrigerator and making disapproving clicking sounds at its contents, "I've been thinking about us. About what we had together. And I realize I might have been hasty in some of my decisions." Hasty. That was her word for 7 years of emotional manipulation followed by running off with a guy whose main life skill was knowing the difference between cayenne and paprika. She turned around and gave me that smile, the one she used to use when she wanted me to agree to something that was obviously a terrible idea, but she'd already committed us to it. I mean, we had something special, didn't we? We understood each other. We had history, shared experiences, real compatibility. This from the woman who once told me that listening to me talk about my day was like watching a documentary about paint manufacturing. Technically informative, but completely soul-crushing. Our idea of shared experiences apparently included all those times she'd made plans without telling me, spent money we didn't have on things we didn't need, and generally treated our marriage like a practice round before the real relationship started. "And let's be honest," she continued, warming up to her theme, "you've never been great with big decisions. Remember when we were looking at apartments, and you almost signed that lease for the place with the broken air conditioning because you felt bad for the landlord? You're too nice, too trusting. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it comes to managing serious wealth." She let the sentence hang there like she was giving me time to process the profound wisdom of her concern. Trevor nodded along like a backup singer in the world's worst boy band. "She's got a point, bro. I mean, not to be harsh or anything, but you've always been more of a, what's the word, follower? Like, you're great at taking directions, doing what other people tell you, but making big strategic decisions about investments and portfolio management? That's a whole different skill set. Portfolio management. This from a guy who once asked me if 401k was some kind of new cryptocurrency and whether he should invest his entire tax refund in it. Trevor's idea of a strategic investment was buying scratch-off tickets in bulk because he thought the odds improved if you purchased more than 5 at a time. Look, Clarissa said, settling onto my couch like she was hosting her own talk show. I know things ended badly between us. I know you probably have some hurt feelings about how everything went down, but that's in the past now. We're adults. We can move beyond all that petty stuff and focus on what's really important here. Making sure you don't lose everything Grandpa Walter worked so hard to build. She'd actually practiced this speech. I could tell because she was using her professional presentation voice, the one she developed during her brief stint selling overpriced skincare products to her Facebook friends. Every gesture, every pause, every meaningful look was calculated for maximum emotional impact. We could be partners, she continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a seductive whisper. Real partners this time, not like before when we were just kids playing house. We both know more about the world now, about what it takes to build something lasting. And with Trevor's business expertise. Business expertise? I interrupted, finally unable to keep quiet any longer. Trevor, remind me what business you're currently running? Is it the artisanal ice cube thing? Or did you move on to that idea about selling air from scenic locations in mason jars? Trevor's confident expression flickered like a light bulb with loose wiring. Well, I mean, those were just exploratory ventures. Market research, really. You gotta test different concepts before you find the right one. That's just basic entrepreneurship, bro. I looked at these two people sitting in my living room. My ex-wife in her ridiculous fake fur coat, holding court like she was doing me some kind of enormous favor by gracing me with her presence, and her boyfriend leaning against my refrigerator like he was posing for a catalog called Mediocre Men Who Think They're Business Geniuses, and I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but full-on, doubled over, tears in my eyes laughter that went on for about 30 seconds while they both stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had a little bit, but it was the good kind of crazy, the kind that comes from finally seeing a situation so clearly that the absurdity of it becomes absolutely hilarious. When I finally caught my breath, I looked at them both and said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. I definitely need help managing all this money. But I think I'll start by hiring professionals, people with actual qualifications and ethics. Thanks for stopping by, though. The lasagna smells great. You know what they say about hell having no fury like a woman scorned? Well, apparently they never met a woman who got scorned out of $5 billion, because Clarissa took rejection to a whole new level of vindictive creativity that would have made Machiavelli stand up and applaud. When Plan A, showing up with fake fur and frozen lasagna, failed spectacularly, she didn't just move on to Plan B. She launched what I can only describe as a full-scale psychological warfare campaign that would have impressed the Pentagon. It started subtle, the way these things always do. Little comments here and there, dropped casually into conversations at the grocery store, the gas station, anywhere she could find someone with ears and a willingness to listen to gossip. "Oh, you know how men can be when they suddenly come into money," she'd say, shaking her head with that practiced expression of concern she'd perfected during our marriage. "I'm just worried about him, He's never been very good with pressure, and this kind of sudden wealth. Well, it can really mess with someone's head." Within a week, half the town was buzzing with rumors about my supposed mental instability. According to the Clarissa News Network, I was apparently having some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by the stress of sudden wealth. People who barely knew me were nodding sagely and talking about how money changes people, and you never really know someone until they get rich. It was like watching a game of telephone where the original message was, "Guy inherited money," and by the end it had become, "Guy might be losing his mind and probably shouldn't be trusted with sharp objects." The beauty of Clarissa's approach was that she never actually said anything directly actionable. She was too smart for that, too experienced in the art of social manipulation to leave any fingerprints on her character assassination. Instead, She'd just raise her eyebrows meaningfully when my name came up, make little worried sighs, and let other people fill in the blanks with their own imaginations and prejudices. I mean, he's always been a little different, she'd confide to whoever was listening, using that tone people use when they're sharing something they probably shouldn't, but feel obligated to for the greater good. Sweet guy, don't get me wrong, but not exactly what you'd call emotionally stable. And now with all this money and responsibility, I just worry he might do something he'll regret. The something he'll regret was left deliberately vague, allowing people to imagine anything from reckless spending sprees to complete mental breakdowns to possibly dangerous behavior. It was masterful, really. She'd managed to plant seeds of doubt without actually making any specific accusations that could be challenged or disproven. Trevor, meanwhile, had taken a different approach to rehabilitating his image and positioning himself as the responsible adult in this whole situation. Instead of subtle whisper campaigns, he'd gone with the fake-it-till-you-make-it strategy, basically strutting around town like he was already managing my inheritance and just hadn't gotten around to the paperwork yet. At the gym, he'd started holding court by the free weights, dispensing what he called wealth management wisdom to anyone who'd listen. Yeah, I'm basically consulting on a major estate right now, he'd say while doing bicep curls that looked more like interpretive dance than actual exercise. Can't go into details, obviously, client confidentiality and all that, but let's just say it's in the billions. Plural. With AB, he'd somehow convinced himself, or at least convinced himself to act like he'd convinced himself, that his relationship with Clarissa made him some kind of expert advisor on my finances. In his version of reality, he wasn't a failed entrepreneur whose greatest business success was winning a chili contest 13 years ago. He was a strategic consultant who'd graciously agreed to help guide an overwhelmed billionaire through the complex world of high-stakes wealth management. The thing about sudden wealth, he'd lecture to anyone unfortunate enough to be within earshot, is that it requires a completely different mindset. You can't just think like a regular person anymore. You gotta think big picture, long-term strategy, global markets. Most people, they get that kind of money dropped on them. They panic. They make emotional decisions instead of rational ones. That's why you need someone with experience, someone who understands the psychology of wealth. The psychology of wealth. From a guy who once tried to return a lottery ticket because he thought the numbers were printed wrong. Trevor's understanding of global markets extended about as far as knowing that gas prices went up and down, and his idea of long-term strategy was planning what he'd have for lunch tomorrow. But he delivered these pearls of wisdom with such confidence that some people actually started believing he might know what he was talking about. The rumors started getting more specific as the weeks went on, and more ridiculous. According to various sources around town, I was apparently hoarding money like a dragon, talking to myself in public, buying weird stuff online at all hours of the night, and acting paranoid about everyone trying to take advantage of him. That last one was particularly ironic, considering it was actually true, but not in the way they meant it. My personal favorite was the story that I'd been seen crying at random movies, which, okay, was technically accurate if you count the fact that I'd teared up during the ending of Finding Nemo at the discount theater. But in the context of the Clarissa smear campaign, this became evidence of my emotional instability rather than just a normal human response to animated fish having feelings. The whole thing would have been more upsetting if it weren't so obviously desperate and transparently motivated. Anyone with half a brain could see what was happening. My ex-wife and her boyfriend were trying to create a narrative that would justify their continued involvement in my financial affairs. If they could convince enough people that I was unstable, irresponsible, or somehow unfit to manage my own inheritance, maybe they could build some kind of case for intervention or oversight. But the thing about small-town gossip is that it has the attention span of a goldfish with ADHD. People got excited about the drama for about 15 minutes, then moved on to speculating about whether the new Chinese restaurant was actually run by Chinese people or if the mailman was having an affair with the woman who ran the flower shop. My supposed mental breakdown became old news faster than a celebrity marriage. Meanwhile, I was having the time of my life playing the role of mysterious billionaire recluse. I'd go to Target and buy socks with cash, just because I could, and watch people whisper about my erratic spending habits. I'd smile and wave at people who were obviously talking about me, which probably reinforced their theories about my declining mental state, but also made me feel like I was starring in my own personal comedy show. The best part was watching Clarissa's frustration grow as her campaign failed to gain any real traction. She'd put so much effort into this elaborate character assassination plot, but at the end of the day, most people didn't actually care enough about my personal life to stay invested in her narrative. Sure, they'd gossip about it over coffee or while waiting in line at the bank, but it wasn't like anyone was organizing interventions or calling for investigations into my fitness as an inheritor. And really, what was she hoping to accomplish? Even if she'd managed to convince the entire town that I was completely nuts, it wouldn't have changed the legal reality of Grandpa's will. The money was mine, fair and square, protected by more legal firewalls than Fort Knox. All she was doing was making herself look petty and desperate to anyone paying attention. But I had to give her credit for persistence. The woman had turned character assassination into an art form, even if it was amateur hour performance art that nobody was buying tickets to see. Just when I thought Grandpa Walter's strategic genius had reached its peak with the ironclad will provisions, the old man managed to surprise me from beyond the grave one more time. It came in the form of Daniel Green, his longtime attorney, a sharp-dressed guy in his 60s who looked like he could negotiate a peace treaty between warring nations and still make it home in time for dinner. Green had been Grandpa's legal counsel for over 30 years, which meant he'd probably seen more family drama and inheritance scheming than a soap opera writer on a cocaine bender. He called me on a Wednesday morning, about 3 weeks into Clarissa's amateur hour smear campaign, speaking in that careful, measured tone that lawyers use when they're about to drop information that's going to change everything. "We need to meet," he said, without any of the usual pleasantries. "There are additional provisions in your grandfather's estate planning that we haven't discussed yet. Provisions that have become relevant given recent developments." Recent developments. That was lawyer speak for your psycho ex-wife and her idiot boyfriend are exactly as predictable as your grandfather thought they'd be, and he planned accordingly. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Nothing fancy, just one of those places where you can get a decent latte and sit in a corner booth without anyone bothering you or eavesdropping on your conversation about multi-billion-dollar inheritance strategies. Green showed up carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than both of us combined, the kind of worn, expensive leather that gets better with age instead of falling apart. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, no nonsense, and settled across from me with the air of a man who'd been dealing with wealthy families' dysfunction for longer than he cared to remember. "Your grandfather," he began, opening the briefcase and pulling out a manila folder that was significantly thicker than anything we dealt with during the will reading, was what you might call a strategic thinker. He didn't just plan for what he wanted to happen. He planned for what he expected other people to try to make happen. He slid the folder across the table to me, and I opened it to find what looked like a complete dossier on every person who'd been in that courthouse the day of the will reading. Photos, financial records, background information, character assessments. It was like Grandpa had hired a private investigator to compile dirt on his own family, which, knowing him, he probably had. "He started putting this together about 5 years ago," Green continued, sipping his coffee like he was discussing the weather instead of revealing that my grandfather had basically been running a one-man intelligence operation on his relatives. "Right around the time your marriage started falling apart, and he began to get a clearer picture of who certain people really were. The Clarissa file was particularly extensive. Grandpa had documented everything: her spending habits, her social media posts bragging about trading up from her starter husband, screenshots of her Pinterest boards planning her future wedding to Trevor, even copies of credit card statements showing her maxing out cards on luxury purchases while I was working overtime to keep us afloat. It was like reading a forensic analysis of my own failed marriage, compiled by someone who'd been paying attention to details I'd missed or chosen to ignore. But the Trevor file was where things got really interesting. Apparently, Grandpa had done some serious digging into my replacement's background, and let me tell you, the results were not flattering. Failed businesses, unpaid debts, a history of jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. And this was my personal favorite: multiple complaints filed against him for trying to trademark common phrases like "living my best life" and "blessed and grateful," so he could charge people licensing fees for using them on social media. Your grandfather predicted, almost to the day, when they would make their first approach, Green said. flipping to a section of the file that contained what appeared to be a detailed timeline of expected events. He wrote this memo 18 months ago. Clarissa will wait approximately 2 to 3 days after the will reading to make contact. She'll start with fake concern and emotional manipulation, then escalate to more direct requests for involvement in financial management. When that fails, she'll attempt to undermine his credibility through social pressure and rumor campaigns. It was like reading a playbook for my own life, written by someone who understood the players better than they understood themselves. Grandpa had essentially predicted the entire sequence of events that had unfolded over the past month, right down to Clarissa's fake fur coat and Trevor's delusional business advice. But here's where it gets interesting. Green continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to reveal the really good stuff. Your grandfather didn't just anticipate their behavior. He prepared countermeasures. Legal countermeasures that activate automatically when certain conditions are met. He pulled out another document, this one with official-looking seals and legal language that made my head spin just looking at it. This is what we call the interference protocol. It's a set of legal mechanisms that trigger when anyone attempts to contest the will, manipulate public opinion against you, or otherwise interfere with your inheritance in ways that could be construed as harassment or defamation. The beauty of Grandpa's system was that it didn't require me to do anything. The legal mechanisms were self-activating, like some kind of legal mousetrap that would spring shut the moment anyone stepped over the line from normal post-inheritance disappointment into active interference territory. All of Clarissa's whisper campaigns and Trevor's fake expertise performances had been automatically documented by investigators Grandpa had hired and paid for years in advance. So what does that mean in practical terms? I asked, because while the legal jargon was impressive, I wanted to know what it actually meant for my day-to-day life dealing with these people. Green smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since we'd sat down. It means that as of last Tuesday, when our monitoring indicated that the interference had crossed into actionable territory, your ex-wife and her boyfriend have been legally prohibited from any further contact with you regarding the estate. Any attempts to contest the will, any continued harassment, any efforts to damage your reputation in connection with the inheritance, all of that now carries significant financial penalties. He flipped to another page that showed a breakdown of potential consequences. We're talking about fines that started in the low six figures and escalated from there, depending on the severity and persistence of the interference. Grandpa had essentially created a legal force field around me and my inheritance, one that would cost anyone stupid enough to test it more money than they could possibly afford to lose. But the real masterpiece, Green said, his voice taking on something approaching admiration, is the permanent exclusion clause. Anyone who triggers the interference protocol gets permanently blacklisted from any future consideration in estate matters, charitable giving, or business relationships connected to the Harrington family interests. Your grandfather essentially wrote them out of existence as far as his legacy is concerned. I sat there staring at this mountain of documentation, this elaborate legal fortress that Grandpa had built around me without ever mentioning it, and I felt something between gratitude and awe. The man hadn't just left me money. He'd anticipated every possible way people might try to take it away from me and prepared defenses I didn't even know existed. There's one more thing, Green said, reaching into his briefcase one final time. Your grandfather left you a personal note. He said to give it to you only after you'd had a chance to see how people would react to your inheritance. The envelope was simple, cream-colored paper with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a single sheet with just a few lines. Kid, if you're reading this, it means they did exactly what I thought they'd do. Remember what I told you about patience being underrated? Well, now you know why. Sometimes the best revenge is just watching people destroy themselves while you stay out of their way. Enjoy the show. Grandpa, you'd think that learning about Grandpa's legal force field would have been enough to discourage any rational person from continuing their doomed quest for my billions. But here's the thing about desperate people. Rationality isn't exactly their strong suit. Clarissa and Trevor had apparently decided that the best response to discovering they were legally prohibited from harassing me was to double down and file an actual court petition claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my inheritance. Because nothing says we're totally not after your money, like literally trying to have you declared incompetent so someone else can manage your money. I got served with the papers on a Thursday morning by a guy who looked like he'd rather be doing literally anything else with his life. Sorry about this, man, he said, handing me the legal documents like they might explode in his hands. Just doing my job. You seem pretty normal to me, for what it's worth. Thanks, random process server guy. Your professional assessment of my mental state will definitely help my case. The petition itself was a masterpiece of creative writing that would have made Grandpa laugh until he cried. According to Clarissa's legal team, and I use that term loosely, since they'd apparently hired the kind of lawyers who advertised during daytime TV, I was suffering from sudden wealth syndrome and exhibiting erratic behavior patterns consistent with psychological distress. They cited my reclusive tendencies, my inappropriate emotional responses to financial discussions, and my refusal to seek appropriate professional guidance. Translation: I wasn't letting them get their hands on my money. I'd laughed at their pathetic attempts to manipulate me, and I hadn't hired them as my financial advisors. In their world, this constituted clear evidence of mental instability requiring immediate intervention by responsible adults, specifically, the two responsible adults who just happened to be the people filing the petition. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I have to admit, I was actually looking forward to it. Not because I was worried about the outcome. Grandpa's legal preparations had made sure this thing was dead on arrival, but because I was genuinely curious to see how Clarissa and Trevor planned to present their case with straight faces. This was going to be better than cable TV. The courtroom was one of those old-fashioned ones with wood paneling and high ceilings that make everything feel very official and intimidating, which was probably exactly the atmosphere Clarissa was hoping for. She showed up dressed like she was auditioning for a role as concerned citizen number 3 in a legal drama. Conservative business suit, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in what I can only describe as a responsible adult bun. She'd even brought reading glasses, which she definitely didn't need, because apparently nothing says credible witness like unnecessary eyewear. Trevor had somehow managed to find a suit that actually fit him, which was honestly more shocking than anything in their legal filing. He'd also gotten a haircut and shaved off the patchy beard he'd been growing, transforming himself from guy who might ask you for change outside a convenience store to guy who might sell you insurance you don't need. It was like watching a makeover show, except instead of improving someone's life, they were trying to destroy mine. Their lawyer was exactly what you'd expect. One of those guys who probably became an attorney because he thought it would make him look important, but ended up handling cases like, my neighbor's dog barked too loud, and I want to sue McDonald's because my coffee was hot. He had the kind of confidence that comes from winning traffic court cases and getting DUIs reduced to reckless driving charges. Your Honor, he began, standing up and adjusting his tie like he was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. We are here today because we are genuinely concerned about the welfare of Mr. Harrington. Sudden wealth can be a devastating psychological burden, and without proper guidance and oversight, even the most well-intentioned individual can make decisions that are not in their best interests or the best interests of society as a whole. The best interests of society. Apparently, my decision not to share my inheritance with my ex-wife and her boyfriend was somehow a threat to the social fabric of America. Who knew that keeping your own money was such a radical act of antisocial behavior? He proceeded to call Clarissa as his first witness, and she took the stand like she was accepting an Academy Award for Best Performance by an ex-wife in a financial drama. She spoke in that carefully modulated voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable and concerned rather than greedy and desperate. I was married to him for 7 years, Your Honor, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly brought as a prop. I know him better than anyone, and I can tell you that this sudden wealth has changed him completely. He's become withdrawn, suspicious, and frankly, a little paranoid. He refuses to discuss financial planning. He won't consider professional advice, and he's been making impulsive purchases that suggest a concerning lack of judgment. Impulsive purchases. I'd bought socks at Target. With cash. Apparently, this was evidence of my deteriorating mental state rather than just a guy who needed socks and had money to buy them. Trevor's testimony was even more entertaining. He took the stand with the confidence of someone who'd watched every episode of Law and Order and thought that qualified him as a legal expert. Your Honor, I've been in business for over 15 years, he began, which was technically true if you counted every failed scheme and abandoned startup as being in business. I understand the pressures and responsibilities that come with managing significant assets, and I can tell you that this situation requires immediate professional intervention." He went on to describe his various business ventures in terms that made them sound like Fortune 500 companies rather than the parade of disasters they actually were. His artisanal ice cube company became a specialty beverage enhancement enterprise. His failed cryptocurrency investment became early adoption of alternative currency platforms. His attempt to trademark common phrases became intellectual property development initiatives. The whole thing was so absurdly over the top that I actually started feeling a little sorry for their lawyer, who had to sit there and pretend this testimony was somehow compelling evidence of anything other than their own desperation. Then it was my lawyer's turn to respond, and this is where Grandpa's preparation really paid off. My legal representation wasn't some ambulance chaser or strip mall attorney. This was one of the top estate lawyers in the state, the kind of guy who normally handled billionaire family disputes and corporate inheritance battles. He stood up with the calm confidence of someone who was about to dismantle their entire case with surgical precision. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from never having to raise it to make a point. "What we have here is not a case of mental incompetence requiring intervention. What we have is a transparent attempt by the petitioners to circumvent a legally binding will through character assassination and manufactured concern." He then proceeded to present evidence that made Clarissa and Trevor's testimony look like what it was: a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create legal grounds for financial interference. Screenshots of social media posts, records of their attempts to contact me for money, documentation of their smear campaign around town, and most damaging of all, copies of text messages between them discussing their strategy for getting a piece of the inheritance. But the real knockout punch came when he presented Grandpa's interference protocol documentation, showing that their entire campaign had been predicted, monitored, and legally prohibited from the very beginning. The deceased specifically anticipated this exact scenario and put legal safeguards in place to prevent it. My lawyer explained, handing the judge a thick folder of documentation that made Clarissa visibly pale. The judge, who had been listening to this whole circus with the expression of someone watching a particularly bad community theater production, finally spoke up. She looked at Clarissa and Trevor's lawyer like he'd just tried to convince her that water flows uphill, then at the mountain of evidence my legal team had presented. "Petition denied," she said, banging her gavel with the kind of finality that usually ends courtroom dramas. "And I would strongly advise the petitioners to familiarize themselves with the legal consequences of filing frivolous lawsuits before considering any future actions." The sound of that gavel hitting was like music, specifically the kind of music that plays when the villain gets their comeuppance in a really satisfying movie. Clarissa's mascara started running, which was particularly impressive since I was pretty sure she'd specifically chosen waterproof makeup for this performance. Trevor muttered something about the legal system being rigged and how this whole thing was just proof that money corrupts everything, apparently not seeing the irony in complaining about corruption while literally trying to steal someone else's inheritance. I sat there watching this beautiful disaster unfold, wondering if it was too early to start shopping for a victory yacht. The aftermath of their courtroom humiliation was absolutely delicious to watch unfold. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves someone getting their ass handed to them by a judge in front of witnesses. Within 48 hours, everyone knew that Clarissa and Trevor had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could get their grubby little hands on Grandpa's money, and everyone knew they'd failed spectacularly. Clarissa's carefully cultivated social circle dried up faster than a puddle in August. Turns out nobody wanted to grab brunch with the woman who tried to scam her billionaire ex-husband and got caught red-handed doing it. Her Instagram followers started dropping like flies, probably realizing that following someone whose main personality trait was failed gold digger wasn't exactly aspirational content. Trevor's situation was even more pathetic, if that was possible. He'd spent so much time bragging about his consulting work on my estate that when the truth came out, he became the laughingstock of every gym, coffee shop, and sports bar in town. The guy who'd been dispensing wealth management wisdom to anyone who'd listen was suddenly revealed as nothing more than a wannabe con artist whose biggest accomplishment was still that damn chili cook-off from 2008. Meanwhile, I was having the time of my life, embracing my new role as the town's mysterious billionaire who'd outsmarted the people trying to take advantage of him. I bought myself a nice house. Nothing too flashy, just a comfortable place with good bones and a yard where I could actually relax without worrying about anyone trying to kick me out or sell it from under me while I wasn't looking. I started getting involved with some of the charities Grandpa had quietly supported. Over the years, discovering that having money wasn't just about buying stuff. It was about having the power to actually make things better for people who needed help. I joined a few boards, attended some fancy fundraising dinners where the champagne didn't come in plastic cups, and learned that there was a whole world of people doing good work that I'd never even known existed. One evening, about 6 months after the courtroom disaster, I was driving home from a charity event when I spotted a familiar sight that made me pull over. There was Clarissa and Trevor's rental house, looking even more run down than I remembered. The porch light was flickering like it was sending out an SOS signal. The lawn looked like it hadn't been mowed since the Clinton administration, and I could swear I heard them arguing about expired coupons through their thin walls. I rolled down my window, looked at that sad little house with its peeling paint and broken dreams, and whispered the words that had been bouncing around in my head for months. Grandpa was right. I get to decide what I'm worth now. Then I drove away, heading back to my comfortable house with its paid-off mortgage and well-stocked refrigerator, feeling richer than I'd ever imagined possible. Not because of the billions in my bank account, though that certainly didn't hurt, but because I was finally free from people who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone to something better. The real revenge wasn't the money itself. It was watching my ex-wife and her chili cook-off champion boyfriend lose at a game they thought they'd rigged in their favor. They'd treated our marriage like a practice round, dismissed me as a starter husband who'd never amount to anything, and assumed they could manipulate their way into the fortune I'd inherited. But Grandpa Walter had seen them coming from a mile away, built legal fortresses around his money, and given me something more valuable than cash. The knowledge that I was worth exactly what I decided I was worth, not what other people thought they could get out of me. And honestly, that feeling was priceless.